that you lose due to the disease, and the sum of that is a disability-adjusted life year for any particular cause. So we have two metrics of impact of air pollution that we're going to quantify, and one is deaths, which is fairly commonly done, and the other is disability-adjusted life years. As I said, I'm not going to talk in detail about how we're estimating exposure. It's a combination of methods based on remote sensing, satellite data, and chemical transport models. One of the challenges that we face that fortunately you don't is that annual average exposures, levels of exposure and levels of PM around the world are much, much higher than they are, unfortunately, in the United States. And so we have to develop a concentration response function that deals with annual average concentrations that can be as high as 100 micrograms per cubic meter PM2.5. I won't talk to you about that, but you should know that that's consumed a lot of our effort. And then finally, we are going to estimate, we're going to provide with our estimates of the overall uncertainty in attributable burden of air pollution. And these will not only include and quantify our uncertainty in the epidemiology that we're using, it will also include the uncertainty in our estimates of exposure as to the best of our ability to quantify that, and our uncertainty in the baseline mortality rates to which we are applying them. So this is an important feature of our work. Next, please. Well, this graph is very similar to ones that you've seen all morning. On the x-axis are arrayed the different cohort studies that have been done. This is all natural cause mortality and relative risks per 10 micrograms per cubic meter PM2.5. That's on the y-axis, and we have, beginning at the left, the American Cancer Society study, and ending on the right with Dr. Enstrom's work. This is indicative of the studies that we reviewed as part of our systematic review, and we looked at these studies, and we looked at other people's reviews as well, reviews that have been conducted by WHO, by COMEP in the UK, and by the US EPA. We reviewed all cohort studies of long-term exposure published through 2009, and we focused, for reasons I told you before, on 9 cohort studies that looked at the association between long-term PM exposure and mortality. Next, please.
You said at one point I thought we're not going to.
Actually, Roger, hold questions. We have a major panel. We can come back to things, but we're really tight on time.
Yeah, I'll be glad to
go ahead.
We'll in details later.
Or catch a break.
Now, the first bullet here gives the bottom line of the review that we did. In the view of our expert group, the evidence is most consistent with a causal association or causal effect of long-term exposure on cardiovascular, non-malignant respiratory disease, and lung cancer. And specifically what we need, how we came to that conclusion is by considering what are the competing explanations that might account for the evidence that's been presented, largely the evidence that was presented to you today. What are the competing explanations for that other than causality in terms of confounding the influence of other uncontrolled risk factors or other biases that are endemic in epidemiologic research? Broad consistency with other related exposures, particularly combustion source air pollution exposures in other than general population settings, and evidence for biologic mechanisms, and Mary went through some of that evidence with you earlier. And in light of that, we concluded that the most reasonable explanation for this evidence is a causal association, it's a causal relationship. We concluded that the shape of the concentration response functions, at least up to 30, are linear or best treated as linear. And as you can see from this slide, which presents the results for ischemic heart disease mortality, which will be important in our estimates, the relative risk estimates, both in terms of the the percent increase in mortality, and in terms of the uncertainty around them as reflected in the confidence intervals do vary. So next, please. We focused on 6 out of 9 studies that reported risk by selected causes of death that we're most interested in for reasons that I said earlier. And particularly on 5 studies that used actual measured PM2.5 concentrations as opposed to estimates converted from other PM metrics. And what this slide is showing is the relationship between the risk estimates, the relative risk estimates for cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular disease mortality, respiratory disease mortality, and lung cancer mortality from the ACS study, the most recent follow-up of the ACS study, and the other studies that also provided estimates for those cause-specific outcomes. And we saw a broad consistency here, although the estimates from the American Cancer Society study appear higher for ischemic heart disease. Next, please. So we are going to, just the bottom line here, what are we going to do and how are we going to use this in our burden of disease assessment? We're going to use the results from the most recent follow-up, Krusky 2009, of the American Cancer Society study to provide a concentration response function between about 5 and 30 for ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, respiratory and lung cancer mortality, using the exposures from 1999 through 2000. We looked at several model forms in addition to sort of the exponential model that's given you by the Cox proportional hazards regression. This slide shows a comparison between that and a linear risk model for ischemic heart disease. They aren't very different. We've looked at a few others as well. So our central estimate is going to be from the American Cancer Society study. Next, please. We are going to estimate as well uncertainty intervals around that concentration response function that I gave you. And the uncertainty intervals are not going to be based just on the American Cancer Society study. They're going to be based on all the cohort studies that gave estimates for a particular cause of death. This, again, is ischemic heart disease. Statistically, this uncertainty is going to be modeled as a gamma distribution. And what that means, basically, is that, in the opinion of our expert group, we thought that air pollution, there's no evidence that long-term exposure to particulate air pollution reduces your risk of mortality for any specific cause that we're interested in, at least, but that there might be no association at all between it. So our uncertainty intervals is going to reflect those assumptions, and then, as I said before, they'll also reflect and try and quantify the uncertainty that comes from our method of estimating exposure and the uncertainty from the project-wide methods that are going to be used to estimate mortality rates. Next, please. So, 3 summary points. In our view, the literature supports a causal interpretation of the results of studies of long-term exposure. These studies, and specifically the ACS study that Dan Krusky described to you, we think provides a basis for estimating global burden of disease attributable to outdoor air pollution in combination with the other evidence as I've discussed. And finally, I'll stress again the fact that our estimates of uncertainty are not going to simply reflect the uncertainty in a concentration response function from a particular study, but rather all important sources that we can quantify. So thank you very much. If you want more information, you can go to this website to learn about the Global Burden of Disease Project, and I'd be happy to answer any questions in detail that people have.
Thank you.